There's a profound and unsettling paradox that sits at the very heart of the French Revolution, a historical enigma that has haunted historians, philosophers, and political theorists for over 2 centuries. The central question is as terrifying as it is complex. How does a modest provincial lawyer named Maximilien Robespierre, a man so obsessively dedicated to the abstract concepts of justice that he was universally known as the incorruptible, transform into the cold-blooded, unwavering architect of a system of state-sponsored terror? To truly understand the reign of terror, one cannot simply look at the cold steel of the guillotine. One must first understand the man who, for a brief, terrible moment, became its high priest. His name was Maximilien Robespierre, and his trajectory from a champion of the oppressed to a tyrant of virtue is a timeless, terrifying warning about the dark, bloody road that is so often paved with the very best of intentions. Before we descend further into this shadow-filled chapter of history, I would like to invite you to become a part of our community. If you believe that understanding our past is essential to navigating our future, please take a moment to click the like button, which helps these stories reach a broader audience. By hitting subscribe and turning on the notification bell, you ensure that you never miss our upcoming documentaries that explore the complexities of the human experience. And finally, if you know someone, a friend, a student, or a fellow history enthusiast who would appreciate this deep dive into the French Revolution, please share this video with them. Your engagement is the vital fuel that allows us to continue unearthing these critical and fascinating narratives. If you find yourself captivated by these journeys into the lives of history's most complex and consequential figures, please consider supporting our channel further. A simple like helps this documentary reach a wider audience, signaling to the algorithm that history matters. Clicking subscribe and turning on notifications ensures you won't miss our future explorations into the past, from the ancient world to the modern era. And if you know someone who shares your passion for history, please share this video with them. Your engagement is the fuel that allows us to continue unearthing these critical and fascinating stories. Maximilien Robespierre was born in 1758 in Arras, a quiet, conservative provincial town in the Artois region of northern France. His early life was not filled with joy but was instead marked by a quiet, pervasive melancholy that would shape his character forever. His mother died when he was only 6 years old, and his father, a struggling lawyer, effectively abandoned the family soon after, fleeing his debts and leaving Maximilien with a premature and crushing sense of solemn responsibility, an emotional scar that would never fully heal. He became a brilliant and diligent student, earning a prestigious scholarship to the Collège Louis le Grand in Paris. He was known to be a solitary figure, often preferring long walks and books to the company of peers, already exhibiting the austere discipline that would later terrify France. There, he immersed himself in the classics, but it was the radical philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau that truly captured his imagination. Robespierre didn't just read Rousseau, he absorbed him, becoming fixated on the idea of a virtuous republic, a society built on the uncompromising foundations of public morality and civic duty. Returning to his hometown of Arras to practice law, Robespierre quickly established a professional reputation that was the absolute antithesis of the ancient regime's corrupt and sluggish legal system. He deliberately sought out cases that allowed him to fight for the marginalized, the poor, the disenfranchised, and the unjustly accused who had no other voice against the powerful. He famously argued a case defending a man's right to install a newfangled lightning rod, pitting the progress of Enlightenment science against the superstitious fears of neighbors. Meticulous, tireless, and utterly uninterested in personal enrichment, he refused the bribes common in his era with a stoic coldness. This unwavering, almost alien commitment to principle earned him the moniker that would define his entire life and legacy, the Incorruptible. In 1789, the tectonic plates of French society, groaning under the weight of catastrophic national debt and centuries of feudal inequality, began to shift violently. King Louis XVI, in a desperate bid to raise taxes to stave off bankruptcy, called for the Estates General. The ambitious, 31-year-old provincial lawyer from Arras was elected as a deputy for the Third Estate. Robespierre packed his bags, his neat, sober suits, and his cherished volumes of Rousseau, and headed for the seat of power. He was stepping out of provincial obscurity and walking directly into the epicenter of a political and social storm that was about to engulf the entire world. Paris in 1789 was not merely a city, it was a supercharged cauldron of human thought, a laboratory where the most radical ideas of the Enlightenment were suddenly being tested in real time. The air itself seemed to crackle with the energy of thousands of pamphlets and raucous public debates that spilled out onto the cobblestone streets. Into this febrile atmosphere, political clubs emerged as the engines of revolutionary thought, and the most influential of them all was the Jacobin Club, meeting in the cavernous, shadowy halls of a disused monastery, where the echoes of monks were replaced by the shouts of revolutionaries. The Jacobins were not just a debating society. They were a roaring fire, a political machine, and a shadow government in waiting. This club became the forge where the revolution's most radical strategies were hammered out. Amid the smoke and the shouting, when Robespierre first arrived in the Grand Assembly, he was a nobody, lost in a sea of more famous men like the booming Mirabeau. His speeches, delivered in a reedy, high-pitched voice, were often met with coughs and polite indifference by the other deputies who found him tedious and pedantic. However, he possessed a weapon far more potent than charisma. He was relentless. He would not be silenced. When his ideas were dismissed in the assembly, he would take them to the Jacobin Club, and when they were dismissed there, he would wait and represent them again and again, refusing to compromise his principles by a single inch. While other politicians angled for influence with the court or the elite, Robespierre cultivated a different constituency, the sans-culottes, the common people of Paris, named for their long trousers. These were the artisans and laborers who were the muscle and grit of the revolution. Robespierre became their tireless advocate, arguing for ideas so radical they seemed utopian. The abolition of the death penalty, the end of slavery in the colonies, and universal suffrage for all men. His consistency was his brand. The people saw that he was not in it for money or fame, but for them. He became their incorruptible voice in the halls of power. This rigid, inflexible adherence to his definition of virtue became, ironically, his greatest political strength as the revolution radicalized. In the chaotic political landscape, other leaders were constantly forced to compromise, to make deals, or to shift their positions. Lafayette compromised. The Girondins compromised. Robespierre never did. This refusal to bend made him an immovable object, a pole star of revolutionary purity. As others were discredited by their own pragmatism or corruption, Robespierre's reputation for incorruptibility only grew. He was no longer just a deputy. He was becoming the very voice of the revolution's radical, uncompromising soul. Before the guillotine's shadow fell over Paris, there was the shining, utopian ideal that drove Robespierre forward. He did not dream of blood. He dreamed of what he called the Republic of Virtue. This was his utopia, a state lifted directly from the pages of Rousseau. It was a vision of a new France, peopled by a new kind of citizen, one who was selfless, patriotic, and moral. In this Republic of Virtue, laws would be not just political instruments, but moral guides, and society would be founded on reason and duty. It was a beautiful, abstract dream, but one that would require a nightmare to implement. The greatest irony of Robespierre's life is that this future architect of mass death was, at the beginning, one of the revolution's most eloquent opponents of the death penalty. In 1791, he delivered a powerful speech to the Constituent Assembly, calling for capital punishment to be abolished entirely. He branded it as base legal murder, an offense against human dignity and a barbaric relic of the ancient regime. He argued, with passionate clarity, that state-sponsored killing was not a deterrent, but merely assassinates the people. His arguments were humanitarian, logical, and profoundly moral, marking him as a progressive light of his age. He demonstrated the same prescient, principled opposition when the revolutionary government began beating the drums of war against Austria in 1792. While the rest of Paris was swept up in a wave of jingoistic fervor, Robespierre stood almost alone, arguing fiercely against the declaration. He warned that war would not export the revolution, it would destroy it. He predicted, with chilling accuracy, that a victorious general would eventually become a dictator. No one, he famously declared, loves armed missionaries. The war, he prophesied, would be a gift to the revolution's enemies and a death knell for its ideals. This, then, is the profound paradox of Maximilien Robespierre. The man who would in just 2 short years endorse the law of 20 to Prario and turn the guillotine into a factory of death was the very same man who had argued that the state had no right to kill. The historical question is not if he changed, but why he changed. The crushing pressure of war, invasion, and internal conspiracy shattered his early idealism. The humanitarian lawyer was gone, replaced by a cold, pragmatic ideologue who believed that extreme measures were the only way to save the dream. The revolution soon faced a critical, existential problem. King Louis XVI was still alive. After his failed attempt to flee France, he was seen not as a constitutional monarch, but as a traitor, a prisoner in his own palace. For the new, fragile French Republic, the king's very existence was a mortal threat. As long as he drew breath, he was a rallying point for royalists within France and for the invading armies of Austria and Prussia who were marching to restore him. For the Republic to live, many concluded, the symbol of the old order had to die. This critical moment forced Robespierre's terrible pivot. He now argued that the king's life was not a legal question, but a political one. The king was no longer a citizen who deserved the protections of the law. He was an enemy combatant, a threat to the survival of the nation. The moral calculus had been inverted. It was no longer immoral to kill the king. It was immoral to endanger the Republic by letting him live. Louis must die so that the nation may live. With this single, chilling phrase, Robespierre swept aside all arguments for a trial or due process. He declared to the convention that to hold a trial for the king would be to put the revolution itself on trial. It would imply that the king could be found innocent, which would mean the Republic was guilty of treason. He argued that the people had already passed judgment. There should be no trial, only a political vote for immediate execution. He had successfully redefined the king as an enemy to be eliminated. On January 21, 1793, Louis XVI, referred to simply as Citizen Louis Capet, was transported to the Place de la Révolution and executed by guillotine. The crowds were massive, and as the heavy thud of the blade fell, a great cry of Vive la République erupted. Robespierre did not attend the execution. He had no stomach for the spectacle of violence, but he had provided its intellectual and moral justification. The incorruptible had secured the foundation of his new republic. On the freshly spilled blood of the monarchy, the revolution had crossed its Rubicon. The execution of the king did not bring peace. It did the precise opposite. It was a gauntlet thrown at the feet of every monarch in Europe. A horrified continent, led by Great Britain and Spain, formally joined Austria and Prussia in the War of the First Coalition. France, the lone republic, was now completely surrounded by hostile monarchies, all vowing to crush the revolution and avenge the blood of Louis. The nation was no longer just fighting for an idea. It was fighting for its very survival against the combined might of Europe. The pressure from without was matched by absolute chaos from within. In the rural Vendée region, a massive, brutal counter-revolutionary uprising began. As peasants waged a bloody civil war against the Republic, it was a war of unspeakable cruelty, where the Royalist Catholic and Royal Army committed atrocities matched only by the Republican. Infernal columns sent to burn and destroy them. In the cities, the economy, crippled by war, utterly collapsed. The assignat currency became worthless, leading to hyperinflation. Bread became scarce, and panic gripped Paris. The revolution, beset by foreign armies, internal rebellion, and economic ruin, seemed on the brink of total failure. It was in this atmosphere of existential, apocalyptic chaos, in the spring of 1793, that the revolutionary government took a fateful step to save the revolution from its enemies. The National Convention created an emergency executive body, a war cabinet with near total authority. They called it the Committee of Public Safety. It was, at first, a rotating body given sweeping dictatorial power to defend the Republic by any means necessary. It was intended as a temporary measure, a suspension of liberty in order to save liberty. And in July 1793, Maximilien Robespierre, the revolution's moral compass, was elected to this committee. The very man who had warned that war would lead to dictatorship now found himself a leader of one. He was not a dictator in the modern sense. He was one of 12, but his power came from his reputation. He was the incorruptible, the voice of Rousseau, the man who could provide the moral and philosophical justification for the terrible things they were about to do. How does a man who built his career on morality justify a dictatorship? Robespierre gave his answer in a series of terrifying, brilliant speeches. He had to square the circle. He had to explain how a government dedicated to liberty could, and must, use terror. His answer would define his legacy and provide the intellectual blueprint for a new, chilling kind of state. His argument began with his ultimate goal, the Republic of Virtue. He argued that, while the engine of a popular government in peacetime is virtue, the engine in a time of revolution is different. If the mainspring of popular government in peacetime is virtue, he declared, the mainspring of popular government in revolution is, at the same time, virtue and terror. Virtue, without which terror is disastrous, terror, without which virtue is powerless. This was his horrifying synthesis. Terror was not mindless violence. It was the swift, severe arm of virtue itself. He proceeded to give terror a new, clinical definition. It was nothing other than prompt, severe, inflexible justice. It was the logical, necessary, and even moral tool required to purge France of its enemies, to cleanse the body politic of the corrupt, the traitors, and the royalists. It was a surgical operation to save the patient. The guillotine, in this new philosophy, was not an instrument of murder. It was an instrument of purification, the terrible, swift sword of the Republic of Virtue. Robespierre's philosophy was now poised to become law. On September 17, 1793, the National Convention passed the law of suspects. This was the legal-sounding mechanism that gave the terror its teeth. It was the moment philosophy officially metastasized into a legal weapon. With the passage of this law, the reign of terror had officially and legally begun. The machinery of death now had its guiding instruction. The true horror of the law of suspects was its breathtaking, deliberate vagueness. It empowered committees to arrest not just those who had committed treason, but anyone who, by their conduct, associations, or comments, seemed to be an enemy of liberty. You could be arrested for complaining about bread prices or for using the wrong form of address. It made suspicion the crime, and enthusiastic patriotism the only defense, casting a net of paranoia over every household in Paris. The prisons of Paris, built for a few hundred, soon overflowed with thousands, aristocrats, priests, merchants, and commoners, all jumbled together in squalor. The air reeked of fear, disease, and sewage. Places like the Conciergerie, known as the antechamber of the guillotine, became holding pens where dukes and cobblers played cards together, waiting for the bailiff to read the list of names. For the day's batch, the Revolutionary Tribunal, led by the ruthless prosecutor Fauquier Tinville, became a conveyor belt of death. Its job was not to adjudicate guilt, but to process enemies. The tumbrils, the open wooden carts used to transport the condemned, became a daily, grim spectacle rolling through the streets, carrying their human cargo to the blade. The terror quickly consumed far more than just the old aristocracy. Marie Antoinette was executed, but so were the Girondins, the moderate politicians who had opposed Robespierre. It consumed priests, generals who lost battles, and merchants accused of hoarding. Increasingly, it consumed ordinary people, peasants and sans-culottes, who were denounced by neighbors, or who seemed to lack the required level of revolutionary zeal. No one was safe from the watchful eyes of the state. Robespierre's vision for this new republic was not just political, it was fundamentally spiritual. He was a deist who looked with increasing, visceral disgust at the wave of de-Christianization led by radical atheists. To Robespierre, this atheism was amoral, chaotic, and aristocratic. He believed that without a shared moral foundation and a belief in a higher power, the Republic of Virtue could not survive. Society, he argued, needed a god to ensure morality. If the old religion was corrupt, he would simply invent a new one. He used his power to crush the atheistic factions and, in May 1794, persuaded the Convention to officially decree the existence of a supreme being and the immortality of the soul. This was Rousseau's civil religion made into state doctrine. It was an attempt to provide a spiritual bedrock for the very virtue he was simultaneously enforcing with the guillotine. On June 8, 1794, Robespierre orchestrated his masterpiece, the Festival of the Supreme Being. It was a massive, meticulously staged spectacle. Dressed in a magnificent sky blue coat and carrying a symbolic bouquet, Robespierre led a massive procession through Paris. He delivered speeches and lit a ceremonial fire to burn in effigy of atheism. For one single, glorious day, he acted as the high priest of his new national religion. For many watching, however, this was not a display of virtue. It was a horrifying display of ego. For his colleagues on the committee, many of them cynical pragmatists, the spectacle was appalling. They watched as the incorruptible preened, and they saw a man who had finally gone mad with power. They whispered that he was not a public servant, but a new pope or king. The festival, intended to be his greatest triumph, was the beginning of his end. The proof of this dangerous megalomania came just 2 days later. On June 10, 1794, Robespierre and his ally Couthon introduced the law of Twenty de Prairial. This law was a direct response to perceived assassination attempts and was designed to accelerate the work of the Revolutionary Tribunal. It was a legal abomination that stripped away the last vestiges of a citizen's rights. The law denied the accused the right to defense witnesses or a lawyer. It stipulated that there could be only two possible verdicts, acquittal or death. There was no middle ground, no imprisonment. It turned the tribunal into a slaughterhouse. Designed for speed rather than justice, it was the legal codification of paranoia. This new law sparked the Great Terror. The Revolutionary Tribunal, unshackled from legal restraint, became a butchery. In the 6 weeks following the law's passage, over 1,300 people were guillotined in Paris alone, more than in the entire previous year. The killing accelerated blindly, becoming a frenzy of blood even as the Republic's armies won victories on the frontier. The trials became mere formalities, often lasting only minutes, with the accused barely having time to speak their names before being condemned. The gutters of the execution square literally ran red with so much blood that the smell became unbearable, a thick, metallic tang that hung over the square and sickened the people of Paris. It is said that the soil beneath the scaffold became so saturated that cattle refused to graze nearby, and the residents of the neighborhood complained of the putrid air. The paranoia within the convention became absolute. Deputies who had voted for the terror saw their colleagues disappear and walked the halls in silence, terrified that a stray word would put them on the next list. They knew this would not end until the man behind it was gone. This process of the revolution devouring its own had begun long before. Before the Great Terror, there was the purge of the Girondins. Robespierre had viewed their moderation not as a difference of opinion, but as criminal treason. He argued that in a time of crisis, there was no room for a middle way. To be moderate was to be an accomplice of the old regime. In June 1793, Robespierre and the Jacobins had harnessed the power of the sans-culottes to force the convention to expel the Girondins. This coup handed total power to Robespierre and his allies, but it established a dangerous precedent. The revolution could and would execute its own leaders. The Girondins were sent to the guillotine, marking a seismic moment. For the first time, revolutionaries were being formally executed by their own revolution. The message was unambiguous. Dissent was now a capital crime. The definition of enemy now included anyone who was not in complete lockstep with the Jacobin agenda. If the Girondins were the right, the revolution's passionate heart was Georges Danton. A loud, charismatic man of the people, Danton was the opposite of the cold Robespierre. But by 1794, Danton had grown weary of the blood. He argued that with the war turning, it was time for a committee of mercy. He called for an end to the terror. To Robespierre, this call for mercy was the ultimate treason. To pardon the guilty now would be to compromise the Republic of virtue and declare that the bloodshed had been for nothing. Urged on by his fanatical ally Saint-Just, Robespierre concluded that Danton had to die. The Republic is lost if Danton lives, Saint-Just warned. In April 1794, the trap was sprung. Danton and his followers were arrested. At their sham trial, Danton's booming voice so unnerved the judges that the committee rushed through a decree silencing him. He was condemned. As he was led to the guillotine, Danton uttered the prophecy that would define the era. The revolution devours its children. His execution left Robespierre isolated at the summit of power. He had killed his only rival, but he had also killed the revolution's humanity. Robespierre was now the undisputed master of France, but his power rested entirely on terror. The convention was a paralyzed body of frightened men. They looked at the empty seats where Danton had sat, and every single one of them wondered who was next. Consumed by paranoia, Robespierre grew distant, withdrawing from the convention for weeks. On July 26th, 8 Thermidor, he finally returned to deliver a fateful speech. He spoke for 2 hours, rambling about his own virtue and a vast conspiracy of traitors within the government. Crucially, he refused to name the traitors. He held his accusations close to his chest. This was his fatal mistake. By threatening everyone and naming no one, he gave every man in the room a reason to fear for his life. He united all his enemies in a desperate need for self-preservation. The deputies spent the night plotting. On the next day, 9 Thermidor, they were ready. When Robespierre tried to speak, he was drowned out by cries of "Down with the tyrant." The chamber exploded in a cacophony of rage. Robespierre's voice failed him. "The blood of Danton chokes him." A deputy screamed. A motion for his arrest was made and passed instantly. The spell was broken. The convention also ordered the arrest of his brother Augustin, Saint-Just, and Couthon. The National Convention had declared its own creators to be outlaws. The arrested men were taken to the Hôtel de Ville, where the Paris Commune tried to rally the sans-culottes. But the people were exhausted and confused. No mass uprising occurred. Robespierre, a man of law, hesitated to lead an illegal insurrection against the convention. In the early hours, troops loyal to the convention stormed the building. They found the Jacobin leaders in chaos. Robespierre was discovered on the floor, his jaw shattered by a pistol ball. Whether a suicide attempt or an assassination remains a mystery, but the result was that he could no longer speak the words that had once commanded a nation. Wounded and broken, the incorruptible was laid on a table in his former committee room. He became a spectacle of fallen power, mocked by those who had once trembled before him. His reign of virtue and terror had come to a sudden, violent end. Because he had been declared an outlaw, there was no trial. The Revolutionary Tribunal simply verified his identity. The man who had denied rights to so many was now a victim of his own ruthless system. On July 28, 1794, Robespierre was loaded into a tumbril with his allies. The procession to the Place de la Révolution was lined with jeering crowds. The people he claimed to serve now cursed him as he passed, shouting insults at the broken man who sat in silence. He was the last to be executed. He watched as his friends died before him. When his turn came, the executioner ripped the bandage from his shattered jaw, causing him to let loose a single, horrifying scream of agony that silenced the square. For a man who had always been fastidious about his appearance, he died in a state of wretched agony, his dignity stripped away along with the bandage that held his face together. It was the last sound he ever made. The blade fell with a heavy thud. The square erupted in cheers that reportedly lasted for 15 minutes, a release of tension from a city that had lived in fear for too long. The architect of the terror had been consumed by his own creation. The revolution, in its bloody climax, had finally devoured its own father. The fall of Robespierre marked the end of the Great Terror. The Thermidorian reaction followed, dismantling the machinery of death. The Republic of Virtue had failed, collapsing under the weight of its own blood and contradictions. Robespierre remains one of history's most divisive figures. Was he a tyrant or a true champion of the poor? His legacy is the uncomfortable truth that the pursuit of a perfect society can lead to absolute tyranny. He proved that virtue, without checks and balances, can be as dangerous as vice. Ultimately, the story of Maximilien Robespierre is a tragedy of idealism corrupted by power and paranoia. It stands as a monument to the dangers of ideological purity. The revolution that began with a noble demand for liberty ended, for a time, in the silence of the graveyard. History remembers him not just for his high ideals, but for the piles of corpses they produced. His life asks us to question the cost of utopia. In the end, the incorruptible was destroyed by the very terror he unleashed to save his dream.